Hello, world. This is Talking Live. We have Jose here again, and he is going to enlighten you on the Constitution. And he's got a book out. We'd like for you to look for that book. It's in Portuguese, but I'm sure that you could get it in English. But he's here today to do a show. We may go in two parts. With Jose, he's so full of knowledge that we have to go quite a while. So here we go.
Thanks for the invitation. This is the second time I come on the show, and I want our listeners to get the context in which I'm going to be saying the things I'm going to be saying. The context basically is this: that my conclusion after some at least 40 years of reading and thinking about these things, is that democracy is not what people think it is. And this is not my idea. Solon in ancient Athens in 463 BC already was aware of this problem. Plato rejected it. Aristotle said that democracy is basically contrary to constitutionalism. And John Adams said that John Adams was a student of history and of the ancient history, as were most of the people of his time. And he said that all democracies in history have committed suicide. And that means that the United States was going to commit suicide because Article 1 of the Constitution institutes the idea of government by the people, which theoretically is a beautiful idea. Wow, we don't have a king anymore. We're going to govern ourselves now, right? We're not going to be told what to do. And the idea was that because the people are voting and choosing their leaders, they're never going to vote against themselves. They're not going to enslave themselves or be subject to some king's tyranny. They, of course, knew nothing about democracy at the time. It was a new thing coming along, a new fashion. And they didn't realize that the same organized interest that, as the levelers had already complained about at the time of the English Civil War in the middle of the 17th century, the same organized interest that dominated and cut deals with the king reorganized themselves under the new rules of of constitutionalism, and continue to rule by basically subsidizing the campaign, contributing to the campaigns of politicians, and so we have this situation that comedian George Carlin even talked about. He said, and this is something that Plato said in his time, forget the demagogues out there moving the masses in particular ways through their big speeches and everything. Forget about them. Forget the politicians. The politicians are just put in front of you by the organized interests who are working behind the scenes in order to give you the illusion that you have freedom of choice. And as George Carlin says, you don't. You have owners, right? He says the country is he says that the United States has been bought and sold and paid for a long time ago, right? Of course, as a comedian, he has to exaggerate, but in essence, that is pretty much the situation that we have been in from the beginning under the American Constitution, because of the democratic electoral method inserted, perhaps naively, perhaps intentionally, but let's say that it was naive, by the, in the Constitution, the Founding Fathers. And because that's not what democracy actually does. The theory of democracy does not control the process. What controls the process is the democratic method, which means what are the rules and who does the ruling, right? So these are the, and when you consider, for example, and I said this here last time, and I want the listeners to understand one thing. Around 1931, Friedrich Hayek, the young Austrian economist, was dissatisfied with the situation in England. He began to point to the fact that what was happening in the British government with more and more controls of the lives of people, and of course the war that was coming began to justify this control, because that's one of the things that happened in war. So that even though they were fighting fascism or the Nazi socialist regime, England was, by its own actions, transforming into itself gradually into something that would, pretty soon after the war, transform itself into something of a fascist nature, right? It didn't turn out exactly that way, but let's look at the situation as it is. I think, and so so he wrote The Road to Serfdom, his famous book, right? The Road to Serfdom, which is a title that Tocqueville had already talked about way back in the 1830s, after visiting the United States, his book, Democracy in America. And his conclusion was that democracy leads to what Tocqueville said was the road to servitude. Hayek simply turned that around and called it the road to serfdom, which sounds a little better in the English language, right? And if you define what socialism is, which was defined by the German socialists at the end of the 19th century, those who laid the foundations of the Soviet state. Of course, Soviet state means democratic state. That's what it means. Soviet Union means, in rough translation, democratic union, right? So the problem then is, how do we control this thing called democracy? Can we control it? And it seems to me, it seems to Schumpeter, it seems to Hayek, and they've written about it. It seemed to the ancients also that democracy is uncontrollable if you allow it into a political system of the kind we have, in which people have politicians, parties, programs, and they go to elections to supposedly elect their representatives. I put that in quotation marks. They actually enslave themselves, for the simple fact that democracy or democratic method is not what it is, and the democracy is not what people think it is in theory, and because it is in practice something different, people go with the theoretical illusion of it without realizing how it's actually working.
But democracy,
Okay.
to me,
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Democracy to me is free will. To me, for the people to come together and vote for what's best for their country.
Okay.
And stand up for what's best for their country.
Okay.
Not to allow anything that destroys democracy.
Okay.
And our democracy, I understand, is when I want to vote, when I want to run a gas-powered car, or I want to have a gas stove, and when people take that right away from me, that's not democracy.
Yeah. Okay. Um, we need to go back to Aristotle, was the great father of the idea of definitions. We need definitions, right? We can't talk about it. And that's one of the problems with the so-called democracy, is that the politicians and the professors and the writers and everybody just talks about democracy all the time. And they don't realize that they may be proposing something that other people think it's either bad or good or should be changed. Let's see how Schumpeter actually analyzes this thing. He says the idea that the people have to vote, of course, we're talking about here in this case democracy simply in the partisan sense of who is going to run the government, because we cannot, unless we are, for example, in a condominium association meeting in which there are 8 or 10 people there, right?
Yes.
Maybe 10 or 15. They're not talking about fundamental rules of law. They're just talking about, okay, are we going to pay this carpenter to fix building A or not? Those are instrumental, practical things. And those, from the democratic point of view of voting or not voting is correct. However, if the idea was to change the rules of the condominium, to alter the rules in such a way that it would give those, the board, the board or the condominium board, powers that were, let's say, not instrumental anymore in terms of spending money or something, but gave them all sorts of powers to do what they wanted, then, of course, this small-time democracy would not exist, right? So I stick to and we're going to come to the definition here that at least the one that I think is a very good one, proposed by Schumpeter in his book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, in which he says, well, the idea that democracy only happens in a constitutional system in which we vote is actually wrong. He says that the democratic principle of popular approval occurs in just about every regime. If a king has 55% approval, let's say if a monarchy has 55% approval by the people according to the polls, then monarchy is democratic, right? If we look at, for example, North Korea, right? Everybody in North Korea, when we see those videos, they're all clapping together as if they all agreed with what the leader up top is saying, right? Or as he's driving by in a limousine or something, everybody is clapping hands all the time. Well, isn't that really democracy also, since you have, let's say, support for the tyrant by acclamation? Yes, that's democratic also, right? So the idea that democracy has to do with voting through parties and elections is actually false, because the democratic, let's say, process, in a sense, appears even in tyrannies. Even tyrannies are democratic, right? Because by educating the people in a particular way, by the control of education, you get the majority of people to think the same way and actually support the tyrant up there, right? We tend to think, for example, and Hayek says this in Road to Serfdom, so did Plato in his time, that what matters is, that the democratic principle, let's say, occurs, it's everywhere, and it occurs in all systems, regardless of whether people are voting or they're not voting. So Schumpeter actually comes to the conclusion that, okay, so we have to define, for example, who the people are. Who are the people, right? We say that it's government of the people, by the people, for the people. Well, children are the people, the insane are the people in prison are the people, the elderly in nursing homes who are dying are the people. Do those people vote? No, they do not. Minors do not vote, right? So who are the people anyway? Well, we have to end up with that about 1/3 of the population, which is those who are allowed to vote, right, the voters. They are usually about 1/3, a little bit more than 1/3 of the population. So how can we say that the people have spoken when only 1/3, and let's talk about the American situation here, in which, let's say, about 1/3, a little more than 1/3 of the people have the right to vote. But in America, people seem to be so dissatisfied with the system that only about 50, 53, 54% appear at the polls, right? So let's say 54% of 1/3 is not the people, right? It's only about
30%.
Yeah, I can't do the math around. I should have written it down. Let's take the situation, for example, in 2012, when Obama was reelected. Only 42% of American voters showed up for that election. 42%. And he won by 51.5%. So that amounts to, considering that, we have this 1/3 of the people voting, then it's less than half. As anybody who knows Washington and parties knows and will tell you that the people have spoken are actually about 10% of the voters, 10% of the population as a whole. In the case of Obama, it was about 7.8%. How can you say that? How can you say that the people have voted, that we have a popular government, when actually only less than 8% of the people actually had anything to do with it or any say-so in the matter, right? So the idea of democracy is convenient. Nobody wants to be anti-democratic. But in practice, that is what happens. We have this beautiful theory of the people governing, when actually the people are not governing. Not only that, there's a second problem. For example, in the condominium meeting in which everybody is there, 10, 15 people, they said, okay, let's spend some money here to, replace the roofs of all these, houses here. And it's going to cost us so much, so we included in the condominium fees, and everybody, instead of paying $400, instead of paying $300 a month, they pay for the next year, they pay $350, and we paid for the roof of the new roofs, right? Okay, those are instrumental things. You can say that that's democratic, even though the rest of the population of those condominiums never appeared there or never voted for it, right? But as long as there's some sort of general agreement that things should be done in a certain way, in practice, not in terms of fundamental law. Now, you can say that even with all these problems of only 10%, 7%, you can still say, okay, it's sort of democratic, right? Because nobody's complaining, right? However, the problem is that our definitions are leading us into an illusion about what's actually happening. I said this here last time, and let me repeat it, because I think this is how I'm going to give you some examples here now. Instead of theory, let's talk about how democracy really works. In 2000, I announced my candidacy for, a seat in the state of, let's say the Legislative Assembly of Florida. As soon as my name came out in the paper, I was invited by the different. Of course, let's talk about something significant here. Being elected democratically is extremely expensive, right? You need to have a lot of support, and there's the problem of communication. How are the people out there who are working and watching football and are not really interested? How am I going to get them to vote for me? I need a lot of advertising. I need a lot of propaganda. I have to do this idea of every day or every week going to some particular group, right, and speaking and saying, this is what I want to do, right? At the same time that the other party, right, my opponent in the district is doing the same thing, got more money than I do, and goes around saying I'm a bad person, do not vote for Joe Stelle. Vote for me because that guy is a fascist, or, that's one of the things happening today. Whenever you disagree with somebody, just call them fascist. And people start maybe believing it. So I was invited to go to, the first one was the Palm Beach County Chamber of Commerce. And they wanted to know what I was going to tell them. I said that I was concerned with justice, but also because they're a business. And I said, there are a lot of regulations that are harming business. We should sit, together and make a list of these, regulations that actually hurt business, hurt them working of the market, and but do not produce any good, right? And they started snickering and stuff, and after a while they said, well, Mr. Stelle, I wasn't a doctor yet at the time. They said, you seem to be a good man concerned with justice and the rule of law and improving. He says, but that's not how democracy works. And so they explained to me how democracy works. They said, we want access. When I asked them, well, what is it that you really want, right? They say access. They didn't define what access meant, but it became clear pretty soon that they wanted me to do the dirty work for them, to write legislation that would even give them business, that would take, taxpayer money and send it to them, or that I would write legislation that would be convenient for them, even though it was maybe against the wishes of the people. And so they, and when I asked, I said, even though we disagree, can you agree that I was a defender of the rule of law and that I'm concerned with justice? Can you contribute to my campaign? And they said, no. And that was the end of the meeting. Next week, I went to talk to the Builders Association. They wanted the same thing, right? They wanted to know how much money I thought of that should be appropriated for the business, for the building industry, right? Building new schools, new laboratories at the universities, new roads, new bridges, right? To give them business, right? So because it didn't seem like I was going to do that for them, they gave me no money, and so on and so forth. Example number two. I guess you've heard of Pella Windows, right? Which is over and produced in Pella, Iowa. Maybe around the year 2000, I forget when. The president, owner, CEO, whatever, of Pella had come to the conclusion that shipping his windows through trucks, which is how he distributed his work, was too expensive, and that if a big long railroad spur were built and lined up right with his warehouse, he could reduce the cost of shipping and distributing, and so he could make more money. And so he was the chairman of the Republican Party of Iowa. He went to it's a district thing, so you went to the district representative there who was running to be district representative in Congress. He said, this is what I want. I'll contribute to your campaign. I fund your campaign, but I want you to appropriate money in Washington to build this railroad spur to my factory, right? And the naive Republican candidate said, "Well, that would be unethical. That's immoral. It's immoral to use, public money that belongs to all the people of the United States to serve you particularly, so you can, reduce the cost of shipping or whatever." So this man quit being, gave up his chairmanship of the Republican Party of Iowa, joined the Democratic Party, and funded the campaign of the Democratic candidate who was running against this one who had denied him his favor.
Yeah.
And the Democrat won as a result, right? That's how democracy works. This didn't happen just in Palm Beach County. It didn't happen this. This happens all over the United States. Okay? It happens at the local, the county, the state, and the federal level. Okay? I think it was the economist and political scientist Hans Hermann Hoppe who said some 40 years ago that the politician, the candidate, comes around and makes all sorts of promises, give you a good speech, whatever, gets what he wants, and then he disappears for the next 2 or 4 years and does what he wants. And we don't know what he's doing. Nobody's actually checking every day to see whether that person is actually voting in your favor or not. Let's look at, for example, the current attack of the GOP, the Republicans and conservatives in general, against the Democrats and say, look how awful they are. Okay, let's talk not theory, but reality here. When was the last time the Republicans voted against raising the debt ceiling? The debt ceiling, what was in 1974? The federal budget of the United States was about $450 billion, right? Well, that includes the inflation and all these things, which are also part of the democratic process. Inflation is a tax, basically, right? It's an illegal. The inflation is a consequence of monetary manipulation and increase of the money supply in relation to a sluggish economy. So prices go up, the value of the currency goes down, and so forth.
Thanks for joining us today. You have been watching part 1 of our very insightful interview with Jose Stelle. Don't miss it as we continue our discussion in part 2 of our show, next time right here on Talkin' Live.
Thanks for joining us today. To watch this show again, be sure to visit talkinlive.com. We now have Roku and Amazon Fire TV channels for you to watch from your home TV. Or find more of our recent shows on most any of your favorite social media platforms. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Good night, world. We will be talking live with you next time. The views and opinions expressed on all Talkin' Live presentations are those of the host and their guests, and not necessarily those of the staff or management of the Talkin' Live TV broadcast studio, or by this channel or its management.